The Texas sun in 1847 was a cruel master. It beat down on the dusty town square of Clearwater Creek, baking the earth until it cracked. That morning, it cast long, skeletal shadows as Marcus Thornfield rode into town. He was just there for the auction, nothing more. A rancher always needs more hands, and with the spring cattle drive breathing down his neck, he was a man in need. He tied his stallion to a post outside the saloon, his mind on logistics, on numbers, on the price of a good worker. He was a man of 32, his face a roadmap of hard sun and harder work, his hands calloused storytellers of building a 3,000-acre ranch from dust and a dream. But success was a lonely fortress on the vast Texas frontier. Lately, his thoughts drifted back, like ghosts on the wind, to a life he'd buried in Mississippi, to a face he never expected to see again. He ordered a coffee, the hot liquid a familiar comfort, as he found a spot to watch the proceedings. The auction block stood in the center of the square, a grim stage where fates were bought and sold. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Silas Crenshaw, was warming up the crowd. Behind him, a line of people stood in the shade of a great oak, their eyes downcast, their futures hanging by the thread of a stranger's bid. Marcus had been to these things before. He didn't like it, but practicality was the currency of survival in this land. He treated his workers well, paid them what he could, gave them decent quarters. But the math of running a ranch was brutal. He scanned the crowd, nodding to familiar faces. Old Ben from the general store, the widow Morrison, Tom Bradley, his neighbor to the north, gave him a wave. "You looking to buy today, Marcus?" Tom called out. Marcus tipped his hat. "Spring roundup's coming fast. Could use the help." The first few lots were unremarkable. Field hands, a blacksmith's apprentice, a cook. The bidding was steady but local. Marcus watched with a detached air, his mind on his own ledgers. Then Crenshaw announced the next lot. "Lot number 7, his voice boomed across the square. "A young woman, approximately 20 years of age, trained in all household duties, cooking, sewing, comes with papers of good health and temperament." 2 men led a small figure onto the platform. She wore a simple brown dress, worn thin by time and trial. A coarse burlap sack, the kind used for potatoes, was pulled over her head and tied at the neck with a rough rope. It was a common, cruel practice, meant to keep bidders focused on utility, not humanity. To stop them from being swayed by a pretty face or a defiant stare. Marcus took a sip of his coffee. Something about her posture, the way she held her small frame with a quiet dignity, sent a strange shiver down his spine. It was a flicker of a memory, a ghost he'd spent 12 years trying to outrun. "Now, gentlemen," Crenshaw continued, his voice slick as snake oil. "This here is a fine specimen, young, healthy, and well-trained, perfect for any household. Shall we start the bidding at $50? Hands shot up. The bidding climbed fast, $60, $70, $80. These were wealthy men, owners of vast plantations who saw people as entries in a ledger. Marcus watched, a cold knot forming in his stomach. One of the main bidders was Walter Grimby, a man whose plantation in Mississippi had bordered the one where Marcus grew up. A man known for his cruelty and his vast, almost obscene wealth. What was he doing here in Texas? At $95, the bidding stalled. It was just Grimby against a stranger in a fine city coat. "Going once at 95! Crenshaw cried. "Going twice! $100! The voice was rough, quiet, and came from the back of the crowd. Heads turned. Marcus looked around, a flicker of confusion on his face, before a cold wave of shock washed over him. The voice had been his own. He hadn't meant to say it. The words had just fallen out. He hadn't even realized he'd raised his hand. Crenshaw's eyes snapped to him, a gleam of surprise and opportunity in them. 100 from Mr. Thornfield. A surprise entry from the man himself. Do I hear 105? Grimby, from across the square, stared directly at Marcus. There was no surprise on his face, only a cold, reptilian amusement. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head and stepped back, conceding the bid. The stranger in the coat followed suit. Just like that, it was over. Sold! Crenshaw's hammer fell with a crack like a breaking bone. To Marcus Thornfield for $100. Sir, if you'll step forward to complete the transaction. Marcus moved through the parting crowd like a man in a trance. $100 was a fortune, more than he could sanely afford. But some deep, primal instinct had taken over, an instinct he couldn't begin to understand. As he reached the platform, Crenshaw was getting ready to remove the burlap sack. It was standard procedure. The buyer had to see the goods before the money changed hands. Let's have a look at your new acquisition, Mr. Thornfield, Crenshaw said with a practiced grin. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of impending doom. He didn't know why. He couldn't explain it. Crenshaw reached for the rope. He pulled. The sack came away, and the world stopped. Long auburn hair, the color of sunset and fire, tumbled free. The woman lifted her head, her movements slow, weary. And then her eyes met his. They were the color of spring grass after a long rain. Eyes that had once looked at him with a love so fierce it could burn down the world. Eyes that now held a universe of pain, confusion, and a soul-deep weariness. It was a face he saw every night in his dreams, a face he had mourned for 12 long years. Elizabeth, he whispered, the name a ragged tear in the fabric of reality. The coffee cup slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering on the hard-packed earth. His legs gave out from under him, and Marcus Thornfield, the man who had built an empire from nothing, dropped to his knees in the Texas dirt. He was staring up at the woman he thought was dead. Elizabeth Hartwell, the plantation owner's daughter he had loved with all the fire of his youth. The woman whose father had looked him in the eye and told him she'd been taken by fever. The woman whose gravestone he had wept over. And on the other side of the square, Walter Grimby watched them, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. He hadn't been surprised at all. He knew exactly who was under that sack, and the look in his eyes told Marcus one terrifying thing. This wasn't over. It had just begun. The crowd buzzed, a confused murmur rippling through the square. This was not the normal way of things. A buyer didn't collapse at the sight of his purchase. Marcus struggled to his feet, his mind a whirlwind of impossible questions. How? How was she here? How had she ended up on an auction block in the middle of Texas? Elizabeth's lips moved, forming his name like a silent prayer. There was shock in her eyes, yes, but something else, too. Something that looked like betrayal. Mr. Thornfield? Crenshaw's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Sir, are you all right? Yes, Marcus managed, his own voice sounding foreign. The sale is final. I'll pay you. His hands trembled as he counted out the gold coins, each one clinking with an unnatural loudness in the stunned silence. He couldn't look away from her. He couldn't process the fact that she was real. Flesh and blood. The transaction was completed. Legally, she was his. Morally, he was lost in a nightmare. He extended a hand to help her down from the platform. Come, he said, his voice quiet, strained. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes searching his, then she took his hand. Her touch was a jolt of lightning, a memory made real. It was her. It was really her. They walked in a bubble of silence toward his stallion, the whispers of the townspeople following them like shadows. I should have brought the wagon, he said, fumbling with the reins, his thoughts scattered. It was a practical thought, an anchor in a sea of madness. He couldn't ride double with her all the way to the ranch, not with the whole town watching this bizarre spectacle. I can ride, she said. Her voice was different, thinner, more brittle than the one he remembered. If you have a spare horse. He nodded, grateful for the simple task. The livery? We'll rent one. At the livery stable, old Pete Johnson gave them a gentle mare, his eyes wide with a curiosity he was too polite to voice. Marcus paid the fee, his hands moving with a remembered gentleness as he helped Elizabeth mount. For a moment, they were 20 and 19 again, stealing moments in the woods behind her father's plantation. But the moment shattered, replaced by the grim reality of the last 12 years. The ride to his ranch was almost an hour of suffocating silence. The Texas landscape, usually a source of pride and comfort for Marcus, seemed alien and threatening. He kept stealing glances at her, half expecting her to vanish like a mirage. But she was solid, real, her back straight as she rode, her gaze fixed on the horizon. What had happened to her? What horrors had she endured to bring her from a Mississippi mansion to a Texas auction block? And what part had Walter Grimby played in it all? His friendly wave at the auction now seemed like a threat. As they crested the final hill, his ranch spread out before them, the large stone house, the corrals, the cattle dotting the pastures. It was a testament to his hard work, a symbol of the life he had built on the ashes of his broken heart. "You've done well for yourself, Marcus," Elizabeth said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was the first thing she'd said since the livery. "It doesn't mean anything," he replied, and he was surprised by how true it was. Not now. They dismounted, and he called for his housekeeper. "Maria!" A middle-aged Mexican woman, her face kind and weathered, appeared from the kitchen. She had been with him for years, a quiet, efficient presence in his empty house. "Señor Marcus," she began, then stopped, her eyes widening as she saw Elizabeth. She took in the worn dress, the exhaustion in her eyes, the invisible scars. "Maria, this is Elizabeth." Marcus stumbled over the words. "She will be staying with us. Please prepare the guest room." Maria simply nodded, her dark eyes filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. She had seen much in her life. "Si, señor. At once." When they were alone in the great room, the silence was deafening. Marcus gestured to a chair. Elizabeth sat, her hands folded primly in her lap, a portrait of composure that had to be costing her everything. He couldn't sit. He paced before the cold fireplace like a caged animal. "I thought you were dead," he said finally, the words raw. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw a crack in her armor. Her green eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered. "Your father," Marcus continued, his voice thick with a rage that had been simmering for 12 years. "He told me you died of fever. He showed me your grave, a marble headstone, Elizabeth. He had them carve your name on it." "My father," she said, her voice dropping to a near, inaudible whisper, "told many lies." She paused, took a deep, shuddering breath, and delivered the first blow. "But that wasn't his biggest one. He didn't just tell me you'd left me. He didn't just marry me off to a man I despised." Marcus stopped pacing. He waited. "After my husband Garrett died, the debts were overwhelming. The plantation was lost. I had nothing. My father was already gone. I went to New Orleans to find work." She paused, and her eyes met his. "My father had debts of his own, gambling debts. He owed a great deal of money to a very powerful, very cruel man. A cold dread, colder than any winter storm, crept up Marcus's spine." "Who?" "Walter Grimby," she said, and the name hung in the air like a death sentence. "When my father died, Grimby considered the debt transferred to me. He saw me as collateral. He came to collect." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Grimby, at the auction, his cold, knowing smile. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "I refused him," Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining a sliver of its old fire. "So he had me taken. He said if I wouldn't be his, I would be no one's. He created false papers, documents saying I was a runaway servant, and he sold me. He sold me to a trader heading west." The room spun. This was a nightmare beyond comprehension. Her father hadn't just lied, he had condemned her. And Grimby hadn't just been bidding on a random woman, he had been bidding on what he considered his rightful property. He had let Marcus win. Why? Was it a game to him? "I've been passed from one owner to another for 2 years," she whispered, the tears finally breaking free, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "From one auction to the next. Today was just another Tuesday for me, Marcus." He stared at her, at this woman who had endured the unimaginable, and a new, terrifying thought pierced through his grief and his rage. Grimby had let him buy her. He had watched it happen with a smile. It wasn't a concession. It was a move in a game Marcus didn't even know he was playing. He'd brought her to his ranch, thinking he was bringing her to safety. He was wrong. He hadn't brought her to a sanctuary. He had brought her to the battlefield. And Walter Grimby, a man who never lost, was about to make his next move. The weight of her story settled over him, a physical thing that made the air in the room thick and hard to breathe. While he was building an empire of grass and cattle, she was living in hell. While he was mourning a ghost, she was fighting for her very soul. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. They were so small, so pathetic in the face of her suffering. "You couldn't have known," she replied, but there was a distance in her voice. He was a stranger to her now, a man from another life. "I should have come back," he insisted, the guilt a hot poker in his gut. "I should have known your father was lying." "Why didn't you?" The question was quiet, but it held the weight of 12 years of abandonment. "Pride," he admitted, shamefaced, "and pain. When he showed me that grave, I thought everything I loved was buried in that ground. I ran. I came here to forget." "And did you?" she asked, her green eyes searching his. He looked at the woman before him, no longer the carefree girl he'd loved, but a warrior forged in fire. "No," he said, the truth absolute and clear. "Not for a single day." A fragile bridge of understanding stretched between them across the chasm of those lost years, but it was a bridge over a raging river. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, her voice laced with a fear that was heartbreaking. She had been property for so long, freedom was a foreign country. "You are free," Marcus said, his voice ringing with a conviction he didn't entirely feel. Legally, he had just purchased her. The bill of sale was in his coat pocket. But that was a lie he would burn. "I bought you to set you free. That's all. You can stay here, in this house, as my guest, for as long as you want. Or I can give you money. Enough to start a new life, anywhere you choose." She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time since he'd knelt in the dirt. She was studying him, trying to see if the boy she had loved still existed inside this hardened man. "And if I choose to stay?" "Then you stay," he said simply, "as a free woman, as my honored guest." That evening, dinner was a silent, tense affair. Maria served a beef stew, but the food was tasteless. The ghost of Walter Grimby sat at the table with them. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like approaching footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like a threat. "He won't just let this go," Elizabeth said suddenly, her fork clattering onto her plate. "You don't understand him, Marcus. He's not a man. He's a collector. Of property. Of people. Of debts. In his mind, you didn't free me. You stole from him." "This is my land," Marcus said, his voice harder than he intended. "My home. He has no power here." Elizabeth gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "A man like Walter Grimby has power everywhere. He has money, and money buys sheriffs, judges, anything he wants. He let you buy me for a reason. It was a message, to show me that no matter where I go, he can find me, and to show you that he can take anything he wants." Marcus stood and walked to the window, peering out into the vast, consuming darkness of the Texas night. The familiar landscape of his ranch no longer looked like a peaceful haven. It looked like a trap. The distant lowing of cattle sounded like a funeral dirge. Elizabeth was right. This wasn't a rescue. It was an escalation. He had just declared war on a man who had never been defeated. He turned back to her, the reality of their situation crashing down on him. "Then we'll fight him." "How?" she challenged, her eyes flashing with a desperate fire. "With what? He has the law, the money, the influence. We have this house, a few ranch hands, and a piece of paper that says you own me." The brutal truth of her words silenced him. He had stumbled into a war without an army, without a plan, armed with nothing but a righteous fury and a love for a woman who was technically, in the eyes of the world, his property. Later that night, as Marcus sat on his porch, the familiar comfort of his pipe doing nothing to soothe his frayed nerves, he saw it. A flicker of light on the distant ridge overlooking his property. A single lantern, held aloft for a moment, then extinguished. It wasn't one of his men. They were all accounted for. It was a signal, a scout. They were being watched. Elizabeth had retired to the guest room, but he knew she wasn't sleeping. They were two prisoners in their own home, waiting for the siege to begin. He had thought that finding her was the end of a tragedy. He was beginning to realize it was only the end of the first act, and the curtain was about to rise on a far more dangerous second one. The next morning broke with a tense, unnatural quiet. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long, every sound was magnified. Marcus gathered his most trusted ranch hands, a dozen hardened men who had been with him for years. He didn't tell them everything. He couldn't. How could he explain that the new guest in his house was a woman he'd bought, who was also the love of his life, and that a powerful sociopath considered her his property? He just told them there was trouble coming. "There's a man, Walter Grimby. He has a grudge against me. He might try to cause problems for the ranch. I need extra lookouts on the perimeter day and night. No one sets foot on this land without me knowing about it. Are we clear?" The men nodded, their faces grim. They were loyal to Marcus. They would follow his orders. But he could see the questions in their eyes. He found Elizabeth in the kitchen with Maria. She was trying to help, but her hands trembled as she kneaded dough. It was an act of defiance, an attempt to reclaim some semblance of normalcy in a world gone mad. "I need to go into town," Marcus announced. "We need supplies, and I need to talk to the sheriff." Elizabeth's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "No, Marcus, you can't. The sheriff, Jedediah Kane, he's a hard man, but he's known to take a liking to rich men's gold. If Grimby has reached him—" "Then I need to know," Marcus insisted. "I can't fight a war blind. I need to know who my enemies are." "Then I'm going with you," she said, her chin set in a stubborn line he remembered all too well. "It's too dangerous." "It's more dangerous to be left here alone," she countered. "At least in town, there are witnesses. Out here, we're just two people on a giant, isolated target." He knew she was right. They rode to Clearwater Creek together, not as a loving couple reunited, but as two soldiers heading into enemy territory. The town felt different today. The friendly greetings were replaced with wary glances and hushed whispers. The story of Marcus's collapse at the auction had already become local legend, and the presence of Walter Grimby, who had taken a suite of rooms at the town's only hotel, had cast a pall over everything. Marcus's first stop was the general store. Mrs. Peterson, a kind, gossipy woman, treated Elizabeth with a gentle pity that was almost worse than open hostility. As Elizabeth selected some fabric to make a proper dress, Mrs. Peterson leaned into Marcus. "That Mr. Grimby," she whispered, her eyes darting around. "He's been asking questions. About you, about your ranch, about her." "What kind of questions?" Marcus asked, his voice low. "How much land you have? How many men you employ? How deep your pockets are?" She paused, then added, "He told my husband you were a man who overreached, that you bought something you couldn't afford to keep." The threat was clear, wrapped in the guise of friendly gossip. Leaving the store, their wagon laden with supplies they might need for a long siege, they saw him, Walter Grimby, standing on the hotel balcony, watching them. He wasn't trying to hide, he was flaunting his presence. He raised a glass to them in a mock toast, a predatory smile on his face. He wanted them to feel his eyes on them. He wanted them to know there was no escape. Marcus's next stop was the sheriff's office. He left Elizabeth in the wagon, telling her to stay put. Sheriff Kane was a big man with a florid face and small, cunning eyes. He was leaning back in his chair, his boots propped up on his desk. "Thornfield," he grunted, not bothering to move. "Heard you made quite a splash at the auction yesterday." "I'm here to report a threat, Sheriff," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "From a man named Walter Grimby." The sheriff slowly lowered his boots to the floor. "Grimby, the gentleman staying at the hotel? Can't say I've had the pleasure, but I hear he's a man of considerable means. What kind of threat?" "He's making it known he has a claim on property I legally purchased." Sheriff Kane steepled his fingers, a smirk playing on his lips. "Is that so? And what property would that be? A prize bull? A piece of land?" "The woman I bought at the auction," Marcus said through clenched teeth. The sheriff's smirk widened. "Well, now, that is an interesting predicament. A dispute over ownership. You have a bill of sale, I presume." "Of course I do. And what does Mr. Grimby have?" "He has lies," Marcus said, "and money." "Money spends the same as truth in this world, Thornfield," the sheriff said, his voice turning cold. "Sometimes better. Now, I haven't received a formal complaint from Mr. Grimby, but if I did, say, if he produced a prior bill of sale, a document proving his ownership before yours, well, then I'd have a duty to recover his stolen property." The trap was sprung. Grimby wasn't going to use force, not yet. He was going to use the law. He would produce a forged document, and the sheriff, paid for his loyalty, would enforce it. Marcus would be branded a thief, and Elizabeth would be legally handed back to her tormentor. Marcus stood there, the four walls of the sheriff's office closing in on him. He had walked in, hoping to find an ally. He had found another enemy. He walked out of the office, his face a grim mask. Elizabeth saw it at once. "What is it? What did he say?" "He's with Grimby," Marcus said, the words like stones in his mouth. "We're on our own." As they prepared to leave town, Tom Bradley, his neighbor, rode up alongside their wagon. His face was troubled. "Marcus," he said, keeping his voice low, "a word of advice. Be careful." "What have you heard, Tom?" "Grimby's been talking. He's telling folks that that she's a runaway, that you're harboring a fugitive. He's poisoning the well against you, Marcus. People are getting nervous. They don't want trouble." Marcus looked at his old friend. "And you, Tom, do you believe him?" Tom Bradley looked from Marcus to Elizabeth, who sat proud and silent in the wagon. He looked at her worn dress, her haunted eyes, and the quiet dignity that clung to her like a shield. "No," he said finally. "I don't. But I'm just one man, and Grimby, he's got the devil's own luck." The ride back to the ranch was even more silent than the ride in. The threat was no longer a distant flicker of light on a ridge. It was here, in their town, in the sheriff's office, in the minds of their neighbors. That night, the attack came. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was silent and deadly. One of the night watchmen, a young man named Carlos, found it. The water in the main trough for the cattle was cloudy, with an oily sheen on the surface. He smelled it, poison. They had tried to wipe out his herd, to ruin him financially. It was a crippling blow, averted only by the vigilance of one young ranch hand. They managed to get the cattle to a clean creek before any had drunk from the poisoned trough. But the message was chillingly clear. Grimby wasn't just coming for Elizabeth. He was coming for everything. He would burn Marcus's empire to the ground, salt the earth, and dance on the ashes before he let them have a moment of peace. Marcus stood by the poisoned trough, the moonlight casting a sickly glow on the water. He looked back at the house, where a single lamp burned in Elizabeth's window. He had thought he was strong, that his ranch was a fortress, but he was just one man, and he was beginning to understand that his enemy wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature, a plague descending on their lives, and the war had only just begun. The discovery of the poisoned water trough changed everything. The threat was no longer abstract. It was immediate and lethal. The ranch hands, who had been merely suspicious before, were now grim-faced and angry. This was an attack on their livelihood, on their home. Their loyalty to Marcus solidified into a hard, protective shell. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of fear. Elizabeth blamed herself. "This is my fault," she whispered, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. "He's doing this because of me. He's going to destroy you to get to me." "This is not your fault," Marcus said, his voice fierce. He took her hands in his. "This is his fault, his evil. We will not let him win." "But how? How do you fight a man who can poison your water under the cover of darkness and by the law by daylight?" As if on cue, Maria entered the room, her face pale. "Señor Marcus," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "there is a man at the door. He says his name is Garrett." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Garrett, Elizabeth's husband, the man she'd said was dead. Elizabeth swayed on her feet, her face ashen. "No," she breathed. "It can't be. He died. I saw the certificate. He died of cholera." Marcus's mind reeled. This had to be another one of Grimby's tricks, a cruel, twisted game designed to shatter their sanity. He strode to the door and flung it open. Standing on the porch was a man who looked like he had clawed his way out of a grave. He was thin and pale, his clothes ragged, his eyes hollowed out by suffering. But beneath the ruin, Marcus could see a ghost of the man from the faded photograph Elizabeth kept in a small locket. "Elizabeth," the man rasped, his eyes finding her over Marcus's shoulder. A look of profound, agonizing relief washed over his face. "They told me you were gone." This was no imposter. This was Garrett, and he was alive. The story he told was a horror story, delivered in a broken, halting voice in the quiet of Marcus's great room. He hadn't died of cholera. The gambling debts Elizabeth knew about were just the tip of the iceberg. He owed money to Walter Grimby, a staggering amount. When he couldn't pay, Grimby had made him an offer. "He told me to disappear," Garrett whispered, his eyes fixed on some distant horror. "He would fake my death. He would take the plantation and Elizabeth to settle the debt. If I refused, he would kill us both. So I ran. I've been living in hiding, a ghost, for 3 years. I thought she was safe with him. A monster, yes, but a rich monster. I never dreamed." His voice trailed off. He had seen the auction notice in a dusty saloon in a border town, a woman matching Elizabeth's description. He'd ridden for days, fueled by a desperate hope. This new revelation was a tactical nuclear bomb dropped on their already devastated landscape. Elizabeth wasn't a widow. She was still married. Her marriage to Garrett, however horrific the circumstances, was legally binding. Her relationship with Marcus, the fragile hope they were building, was a fantasy, and Grimby knew. Of course he knew. This was his checkmate. He had orchestrated everything. He had let Garrett escape and find his way here. He had created a situation so legally and morally tangled that Marcus and Elizabeth would have no way out. If Marcus fought to keep her, he was not only harboring a fugitive slave, but also committing adultery with another man's wife. He would be ruined socially, legally, and financially. The entire community, even his friends like Tom Bradley, would be forced to turn against him. You have to let me go, Elizabeth said that night, after Garrett had been given a room to rest. Her voice was dead, devoid of all hope. She had built a wall of ice around herself. It's the only way. I am his wife. That is the law. You have to give me back to him. And let him hand you over to Grimby? Never, Marcus vowed. Then what, Marcus? She cried, her composure finally shattering. What is your grand plan? We are trapped. He thought of everything. My husband is alive. In the eyes of God and the law, I am his. Our love, this dream we had for 5 minutes, it's over. He has won. She collapsed into a chair, her body racked with sobs of pure despair. He had never felt so helpless. Every move he made, Grimby was 3 steps ahead. He was playing chess with a grandmaster who had written the rules and owned the board. Just then, Maria appeared in the doorway. She was no longer the quiet, demure housekeeper. Her eyes were hard, her face set. She held a small, leather-bound book in her hand. "Senor," she said, her voice low and steady, "I do not know this man Grimby, but I know men like him, my family. We lost our land in Mexico to such a man. They use the law, they use paper, they use lies, until the lies become the truth." She walked forward and placed the book on the table in front of Marcus. It was an old ledger. "This belonged to my husband," Maria said. "He worked for a man, a trader, who did business with many powerful people, including a man from Mississippi, a man who sold his own daughter." Marcus's blood ran cold. He opened the ledger. Maria's husband had been a meticulous record keeper, and there, on a page dated over 2 years ago, was an entry. Received from W. Grimby, one female, E. Hartwell, in exchange for cancellation of debt owed by her late father, Cole J. Hartwell, to be sold at Western markets. Bill of sale fraudulent, as per Mr. Grimby's instruction, to list her as runaway indentured servant Eliza. It was there, in black and white. Proof that Grimby had conspired to illegally traffic a free woman. Proof that the entire foundation of his claim was a criminal fraud. It wouldn't solve the problem of Garrett, but it was a weapon, a powerful one. But as Marcus stared at the entry, a new, horrifying piece of the puzzle slid into place. Maria's husband, the man who wrote this, had died a year ago. A sudden, mysterious illness that the town doctor couldn't explain. It hadn't been an illness. It had been murder. Grimby wasn't just a monster. He was a killer. And now they had the very book that had likely gotten Maria's husband killed. "He knows about this book," Marcus whispered, looking from the ledger to Maria's grim face. "I do not think so," Maria said. "My husband, he told me he made a copy of the most important pages. He said he sent them to a friend, a man of the law in Austin, an honest man, just in case." A flicker of hope, a tiny, defiant spark in the suffocating darkness. "We need to get this ledger to Austin," Marcus said, his mind racing. "We need to get to that lawyer." But how? Grimby's men were watching the ranch. The local sheriff was in his pocket. A trip to Austin would be a suicide mission. They would be ambushed on the road before they got 10 miles. Then, Elizabeth spoke, her voice clear and strong. The tears were gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "No," she said. "A trip to Austin is what he would expect. We aren't going to Austin." Marcus looked at her. "Then what are we going to do?" "We are going to Mississippi," she said. "Grimby's power is here, in Texas, where he has bought and paid for it. But his crimes began in Mississippi. The proof of his original fraud, the fake papers, the witnesses to my father's dealings, they're all there. It's the one place he won't expect us to go. We're not going to run. We're going to hunt." It was an insane plan. A journey of 1,000 miles back into the heart of the world that had destroyed her. But as he looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, he knew she was right. It was the only way. They couldn't win by defending. They had to attack. The next morning, A plan, desperate and fraught with peril, began to form. They would need a diversion, a big one, something to draw Grimby's attention and pull his men away from the ranch, giving them a window to escape. Tom Bradley, Marcus's neighbor, was their only hope. Marcus rode to the edge of his property and sent one of his hands to fetch him, meeting in a secluded canyon where they wouldn't be seen. He laid out the whole story. The auction, Grimby, the poisoned water, the return of Garrett, the ledger, everything. Tom listened, his weathered face growing grimmer with every word. When Marcus was finished, Tom was silent for a long time, chewing on a piece of straw. "He's the devil himself," Tom said finally. "And he's brought hell to Clearwater Creek. What do you need?" "A diversion," Marcus said. "I need you to start a rumor, a big one. Tell everyone you heard from one of my hands that I found gold on my land. A rich vein. Say I'm fortifying the ranch to protect it. It'll cause a frenzy. Gold fever is a powerful thing. It'll draw prospectors, city folk, maybe even the sheriff himself. It will create chaos." Tom grinned. It was a dangerous, brilliant idea. "Consider it done," he said. "It'll be the biggest lie this county has ever seen. How much time will it buy you?" "A day, maybe 2 if we're lucky," Marcus replied. "We'll leave tonight, under the cover of darkness." That left the problem of Garrett. He was weak, sick, and a ghost in his own life. But he was also Elizabeth's husband. He couldn't be left behind, but he couldn't make the journey. Elizabeth was the one who spoke to him. She found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the land with hollow eyes. "Garrett," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "we are leaving. We're going to find proof to destroy Grimby. But you can't come with us. You're not well enough." He looked at her, his face a mask of shame and regret. "I am your husband," he whispered. "I should be protecting you." "You can protect me," she said, "by staying here. Marcus's men will look after you. Maria will care for you. When this is over, we will sort out what comes next. But for now, your role is to survive. Can you do that for me?" He nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "I failed you, Elizabeth. I failed you in every way a man can fail his wife. We were both victims of the same monster," she said. "Let's not fail ourselves now." That night, as the first whispers of a gold strike started to snake their way through town, Marcus and Elizabeth prepared to leave. They traveled light, taking 2 of the fastest horses, supplies for a week, and the precious ledger, which Marcus had wrapped in oilskin and hidden in his saddlebag. Maria pressed a small, heavy purse into Elizabeth's hand. "My life savings," she said simply. "May God go with you." They slipped away from the ranch like thieves in the night, riding south first to throw off any trackers before turning east toward the long, dangerous road to Mississippi. As they rode, Elizabeth told him something else, a detail from Garrett's rambling story that had lodged in her mind. "Garrett said that when Grimby faked his death, he had help," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "A doctor. A man who signed the false death certificate. He said the doctor was a drunk, easily blackmailed. His name was Alistair Finch, and he lived in a small town just over the border in Louisiana. A new destination. A new lead. A corrupt doctor would be the first brick in the wall of evidence they needed to build. For 3 days, they rode hard, sleeping in hidden gullies, avoiding towns, their senses on high alert. The open country was both beautiful and terrifying. Every rider on the horizon was a potential threat, every distant campfire a possible ambush. But they saw no one. Tom Bradley's ruse seemed to be working. The lure of gold was keeping Grimby and his hounds occupied in Texas. They crossed into Louisiana, the landscape changing from dry plains to swampy, humid marshland. The air grew thick and heavy. They found the town where Dr. Finch was supposed to live, a miserable collection of shacks sinking into the mud on the edge of a bayou. It It wasn't hard to find the doctor. He was the town's only one, and its most notorious drunk. They found him in a filthy lean-to behind the saloon, passed out on a cot, an empty bottle of laudanum beside him. Marcus woke him with a bucket of brackish water. The doctor came up sputtering, his eyes wild with fear and confusion. He was a wreck of a man, his hands shaking, his face a road map of burst blood vessels. "Dr. Finch," Marcus said, his voice cold as steel, "we need to talk about Garrett Cobb and Walter Grimby." The doctor's face went white. He started to babble, to deny everything. But Elizabeth stepped forward, out of the shadows. "I am Elizabeth Cobb," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that cut through the doctor's haze. "The wife of the man you declared dead. The woman whose life you helped destroy for a few bottles of poison." Finch collapsed, weeping. "He made me do it," he cried. "Grimby. He knew about a mistake I made, a patient who died. He said he'd see me hang. He forced me to sign the certificate. I never wanted to." "We don't want you," Marcus said. "We want your testimony. A signed affidavit, admitting what you did, admitting Grimby blackmailed you into committing fraud." The doctor, terrified and seeing a chance to save his own skin, agreed immediately. He scribbled out a confession on a piece of paper Marcus provided, his hand shaking so badly his signature was almost illegible. But it was enough. It was their first piece of concrete evidence. As they rode away from the wretched town, a sense of grim triumph filled them. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. They had a weapon, but their celebration was short-lived. As they made camp that night, deeper in the Louisiana swamps, they heard the baying of hounds in the distance, not the sound of hunting dogs. These were tracker dogs, the kind used to hunt men. Grimby had seen through the gold rush ruse. Or perhaps it had never been meant to hold him for long. He wasn't just chasing them anymore. He was hunting them. And he was closing in. They were hundreds of miles from home, alone, in a hostile, unforgiving swamp with a pack of wolves on their trail. The small victory with Dr. Finch suddenly felt hollow. They hadn't just found evidence. They had kicked the hornet's nest, and now the entire swarm was coming for them. The baying of the hounds grew closer, a relentless, terrifying sound that echoed through the cypress trees. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up Marcus's throat. But one look at Elizabeth's face steadied him. Her fear was there, but it was overshadowed by a white-hot fury. She would not be a victim again. "They're using the swamp to their advantage," Marcus said, his mind racing. "The horses will slow us down in this terrain, and they leave an obvious trail." "So we leave the horses," Elizabeth said, her eyes scanning the dark, twisted landscape. "The water. We have to use the water. It will hide our scent." It was a desperate gamble. They abandoned their horses, taking only the supplies they could carry, the precious ledger, and Dr. Finch's confession. They plunged into the murky, waist-deep water of the bayou, the darkness swallowing them whole. The water was cold, teeming with unseen things that brushed against their legs. Every splash sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. For hours they waded through the labyrinthine waterways, guided only by the moon filtering through the thick canopy of Spanish moss. The sound of the dogs grew fainter, confused by the lost trail. They had bought themselves some time. They found a small, overgrown island, barely more than a hump of solid ground, and collapsed, exhausted and freezing. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gray, they knew they couldn't stay. Grimby's men would be relentless. "We need a boat," Elizabeth whispered, her teeth chattering. "We need to get downriver, to New Orleans." It was a city that held nothing but horror for her, but it was also a major port, a place where they could lose themselves in the crowds, a place where they could find passage on a ship heading east. Their luck, for once, held. They stumbled upon a small, isolated trapper's shack. The trapper, a grizzled old Cajun man who called himself Jacques, was wary at first. But Elizabeth, using the French her governess had taught her as a child, was able to speak to him in his own dialect. She told him a modified version of the truth, that they were running from a cruel landowner who had laid a false claim on her. The old man's eyes, which had seen a lifetime of injustice along the river, softened. He had no love for powerful men who trampled the poor. For a few of the gold coins from Maria's purse, he agreed to sell them his old pirogue, a small, shallow-draft canoe perfect for navigating the bayou. He also gave them dried fish, fresh water, and a stark warning. "The river is treacherous," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "But the men who follow you are worse. Travel only at night. During the day, hide, and trust no one." For the next 4 days, they lived like ghosts. By day, they pulled the pirogue into thick, overgrown inlets, covering it with branches, and slept in fitful, mosquito-plagued shifts. By night, they paddled down the slow, dark river, the silence of the swamp broken only by the chirping of insects and the occasional bellow of a distant alligator. The journey was a crucible that burned away the last of the distance between them. Huddled together in the tiny boat, facing a common enemy, they were no longer just Marcus and Elizabeth, the rancher and the survivor. They were a single unit, bound by a shared past and a desperate hope for a future. They spoke in low whispers, sharing stories of their lost years, filling in the gaps, mending the broken pieces of their lives. The love they'd had as kids was being reforged into something harder, stronger, tempered by loss and fire. They finally reached the outskirts of New Orleans, a city teeming with life, noise, and danger. They sold the pirogue and used the last of their money to buy passage on a coastal steamer headed for Mobile, Alabama. It was the last leg of their journey before they would have to travel overland into Mississippi. On the crowded deck of the steamer, surrounded by hundreds of strangers, they felt a fleeting sense of safety. But as the ship pulled away from the dock, Marcus saw a man standing at the end of the pier, watching them. A man in a fine city coat, the same man who had been bidding against him for Elizabeth at the auction in Texas. It wasn't one of Grimby's rough-hewn trackers. This was someone else. The stranger's eyes met Marcus's across the water, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning and disappearing into the crowd. A chill ran down Marcus's spine. Who was he? Was he one of Grimby's men? Or was there another player in this deadly game they didn't know about? The feeling of being hunted returned, stronger than ever. They hadn't escaped the swamp. They had just entered a larger, more complicated jungle. The sea journey to Mobile was a torment of suspense. Every crew member, every fellow passenger, was a potential threat. The man on the pier haunted Marcus's thoughts. He hadn't looked like a henchman. He looked calculating, intelligent. What was his role in all this? They disembarked in Mobile and immediately sought to disappear, buying cheap, simple clothes and booking passage on a dusty carriage heading north into the heart of Mississippi, back to where it all began. The closer they got to her childhood home, the quieter Elizabeth became. The landscape was a tapestry of painful memories. Every grand plantation house, every field of cotton, was a reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. "My father's study," she said one night as they camped by the side of the road. "He kept everything there. Ledgers, letters, contracts. He was a meticulous man. If there is any proof of his dealings with Grimby, it will be there." "The house is owned by strangers now," Marcus reminded her gently. "We can't just walk in." "I know," she said, a new, cunning light in her eyes. "But I know that house better than anyone alive. I know its secrets. There's a cellar entrance around the back, hidden by overgrown ivy. It's how I used to sneak out to meet you." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen in days. They arrived at the Hartwell plantation, now called The Willows, by its new owners, late at night. The grand house was dark, asleep. It looked smaller somehow, less imposing than in Marcus's memory. As Elizabeth had promised, the cellar entrance was still there, hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy. With his heart pounding, Marcus pried open the old wooden door. It groaned in protest. They slipped inside, into the damp, musty darkness of the cellar. They crept up the stairs and into the main house. It was like walking into a museum of their own past. The furniture was different, but the layout was the same. The ghosts of their youth were everywhere. They found the study. It was locked. Marcus, using skills he'd learned in leaner times, managed to pick the simple lock with his knife. The room was just as he remembered it, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a large mahogany desk, the faint smell of leather and old paper. They lit a small candle, its flickering light dancing across the room. They had to work fast. They started searching the desk, going through drawers filled with the new owner's papers. Nothing. They turned to the bookshelves, running their hands along the spines of her father's old books. Then Elizabeth stopped. She was staring at a large leather-bound copy of Shakespeare's tragedies. "This was his favorite," she whispered. "He read from it every night." She pulled the heavy volume from the shelf. It felt wrong, too light. She opened it. The inside had been hollowed out, and nestled within the empty space was another book, a small, black, personal diary. Her father's diary. Her hands trembling, Elizabeth opened it. Her father's neat, precise script filled the pages. She flipped through, her eyes scanning dates, names, entries, and then she found it. An entry from the month after Garrett had died. "Grimby was here today. He is a vulture. He took the deed to the plantation to settle my debts as we agreed. But he is not satisfied. He wants Elizabeth. He speaks of her not as a woman, but as a prized mare he wishes to add to his stable. I have condemned my own daughter. I told him she is still in mourning, that he must wait. But he is not a patient man. I have created a monster, and now he is at my door." It was the confession they were looking for, the proof that her father had been a party to the fraud, a weak man who had sacrificed his own child to a predator. But as Elizabeth read the next entry, a gasp escaped her lips. Her face went pale. "What is it?" Marcus asked, his voice urgent. She read aloud, her voice shaking. "I have found a way out, a final act of penance. Grimby does not know the full extent of my assets. My wife, bless her soul, came from old money in Charleston. She left a trust for Elizabeth, to be claimed upon her 25th birthday or her marriage, whichever came first. The funds are held by a law firm in Charleston, Pettigrew, Finch, and Associates. The amount is substantial, enough for her to live a life of independence, enough to escape this hell I have made for her. I have written to the lawyers, informing them of my demise and Elizabeth's circumstances, and enclosed the original trust documents. They are instructed to find her. It is my only hope for redemption. May God forgive me." Marcus stared at her, his mind struggling to grasp the implications. A trust fund? A fortune? All this time, Elizabeth had been a wealthy woman and had never known it. And then another piece clicked into place with sickening clarity. The lawyer in Charleston, Pettigrew, Finch, and Associates. Dr. Alastair Finch, the man they'd just gotten a confession from in Louisiana, wasn't just a random drunk Grimby had blackmailed. He was related to the very law firm that held Elizabeth's fortune. Grimby hadn't just stumbled upon Dr. Finch. He had targeted him. He must have known about the trust all along. This wasn't just about owning Elizabeth. It was about controlling her inheritance. If he could legally declare her his property, or have her declared dead, he could make a claim on the fortune himself. And the man on the pier in New Orleans, the man in the fine city coat, what if he wasn't one of Grimby's men? What if he was from the law firm? What if he was the finder her father had written about, trying to locate the lost heiress? Suddenly, there was a loud crash from downstairs. A lamp had been knocked over. Shouts echoed through the silent house. "Who's there? Show yourself!" The new owners were awake. They had been discovered. They had to get out. Now. They fled, plunging back into the cellar and out into the night, the diary clutched in Elizabeth's hand. As they ran across the dark fields, they could hear the sounds of pursuit behind them. A shotgun blast ripped through the night air, the sound unnervingly close. They had the proof they needed. But they had also alerted the entire countryside to their presence. They were no longer ghosts. They were intruders, fugitives. And now, they weren't just running from Grimby. They were running from the law again, this time in Mississippi. Their perilous journey had just become infinitely more complicated. They ran until their lungs burned, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the woods where they had hidden their horses. They were safe, for the moment, but they were now fugitives in 2 states. "This changes everything," Marcus said, breathing heavily as they leaned against a tree, the precious diary held tightly between them. "The trust fund. Dr. Finch. It's all connected. Grimby's playing a much bigger game than we ever imagined." "He wants the money," Elizabeth said, the realization dawning on her with cold horror. "He never just wanted me. He wanted my inheritance. If I'm his legal property, his slave, then whatever I own, he owns. That's why he needed Garrett alive, to invalidate any claim you might have on me. It's why he needed Dr. Finch to control the flow of information from the law firm." They had stumbled into a conspiracy that was deeper and darker than they could have possibly fathomed. This was a long con, years in the making, and they were the final pieces he needed to fall into place. "So what's our next move?" Marcus asked. "We can't go back to Texas. Grimby and the sheriff will be waiting. We can't stay here. We're wanted for breaking and entering." Elizabeth looked east, in the direction of the coast. "Charleston," she said, her voice firm. "We go to the source. We go to the law firm of Pettigrew, Finch, and Associates. We present them with this diary, with Dr. Finch's confession. We claim my inheritance, and we use that money and that power to hire our own lawyers. We fight Grimby on his own terms." It was a bold, audacious plan, to walk into the lion's den, but it was the only move they had left. The journey to Charleston was a nightmare of paranoia. They traveled by day now, hiding in plain sight, pretending to be a simple married couple. Every stranger's glance felt like an accusation. Every town they passed through was a potential trap. As they got closer to Charleston, Elizabeth's resolve hardened. She was no longer just a survivor. She was an heiress on a mission to reclaim her life and her fortune. She bought a new dress, a simple but elegant one, and began to carry herself with the quiet confidence of her breeding. She was transforming, shedding the skin of the victim and donning the armor of a woman of means. They arrived in Charleston, a city of old-world charm and old money. It felt like a different country from the raw, dusty frontier of Texas. They found the offices of Pettigrew, Finch, and Associates in a stately brick building in the city's legal district. Taking a deep breath, they walked in. The clerk at the front desk looked them up and down, his gaze lingering on their travel-worn clothes. "We are here to see Mr. Pettigrew," Elizabeth announced, her voice clear and steady. "It is a matter of some urgency regarding the Hartwell Trust." The clerk's eyes widened slightly at the name. He disappeared into a back office. A few moments later, a tall, silver-haired man in a perfectly tailored suit emerged. He had a sharp, intelligent face and piercing blue eyes. It was the man from the pier in New Orleans. "Mr. Thornfield," he said, his eyes locking on Marcus. "And you must be Miss Elizabeth Hartwell. Or should I say, Mrs. Cobb?" His voice was smooth, calm, but held an undercurrent of something Marcus couldn't quite decipher. "My name is Elizabeth Hartwell," she said, lifting her chin. "And you are?" "I am Jonathan Pettigrew," he said with a slight bow. "I am the senior partner of this firm, and I have been looking for you for a very long time." He led them into a large, opulent office lined with law books. He closed the door, his expression turning serious. Your father, Colonel Hartwell, wrote to me before his death, Pettigrew began. He told me of his dire circumstances and of the trust he had set up for you. He asked me to find you. My investigations led me to New Orleans, where the trail went cold. Then, I heard whispers of a man named Grimby, who had acquired a woman matching your description. I followed him to Texas. I was at the auction. You saw what happened, Marcus said, his voice tight. You saw him buy her. I did, Pettigrew confirmed. And I confess, I was at a loss. My instructions were to aid you, but intervening directly in a legal auction in a state where I have no jurisdiction would have been problematic. So I watched. And I waited. I followed you from New Orleans. I must say, your journey has been quite remarkable. Elizabeth placed her father's diary and Dr. Finch's confession on the polished desk. We have proof, Mr. Pettigrew. Proof that Walter Grimby has engaged in fraud, kidnapping, and conspiracy to steal my inheritance. Pettigrew read the documents carefully, his expression growing darker with every page. When he finished, he looked up, his blue eyes like chips of ice. This is monstrous, he said, and Dr. Alastair Finch is my cousin, a disgrace to our family name. I knew he had his demons, but I never suspected this level of depravity. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the bustling street. Walter Grimby is a man of considerable influence. Even with this evidence, a legal battle would be long, costly, and dangerous. He will not simply surrender. We are not asking for a legal battle, Marcus said. We are asking for what is rightfully hers, her inheritance. With it, we can fight our own battles. Pettigrew turned back to them, a strange, calculating look on his face. Of course, the trust is yours. It is a significant sum. However, there is a complication, a legal stipulation in your mother's will. What stipulation? Elizabeth asked, a new sense of dread creeping over her. The trust can only be released to you upon your marriage to a man of suitable standing and character, Pettigrew said, his voice flat, or upon your 25th birthday. As you are not yet 25, the marriage clause is the only one that applies. The room fell silent. Another trap, this one laid by a loving mother from beyond the grave. I am married, Elizabeth said quietly. To Garrett Cobb. Pettigrew shook his head slowly. A man who, by his own admission, abandoned you and participated in a scheme to defraud you. A man currently living under the charity of your companion. I'm afraid, Mrs. Cobb, that my partners and I would have a very difficult time arguing that he meets the suitable character clause. In fact, he is the very definition of unsuitable. Marcus felt the floor drop out from under him. They were so close, and yet another door had slammed shut in their faces. So what are you saying? Marcus demanded. That she can't access her own money? I am saying, Pettigrew replied, his gaze shifting to Elizabeth, that the trust is currently inaccessible, unless your marital situation were to change. He let the words hang in the air. The implication was clear, shocking, and utterly ruthless. For Elizabeth to claim her fortune, her marriage to Garrett Cobb would have to be dissolved. And in their world, there were only two ways a marriage could be dissolved: divorce, a long, scandalous, and uncertain process, or death. They had walked into the lawyer's office seeking a savior. Instead, they had found a chess player just as cold and calculating as Grimby himself. Pettigrew didn't want a messy fight. He wanted a clean, simple solution. And in the chilling silence of that office, Marcus realized that they were nothing more than pieces on a board, being moved by powerful, invisible hands. And the game was far from over. The lawyer's words hung in the air, cold and sharp as shards of glass. Dissolve the marriage. The implication was monstrous. Marcus stared at Pettigrew, seeing him for what he was. Not an ally, but a pragmatist. a man who dealt in clean solutions, not messy morality. There will be no talk of divorce or anything else, Marcus said, his voice a low growl. We will find another way. Pettigrew gave a small, regretful sigh. As you wish. But time is not on your side. Walter Grimby is not an idiot. He knows you've gone to ground. He will be turning over every stone from here to Texas. Sooner or later, he will learn about the trust. He will find his way to Charleston, and he will come for you. He was right. They were living on borrowed time. They left the lawyer's office and found a room in a modest boarding house, the weight of their new predicament pressing down on them. They had the truth, but the truth was worthless without the power to wield it. He's a snake, Elizabeth said, pacing the small room. Pettigrew. He's just as bad as Grimby, only he hides it behind expensive suits and legal jargon. He wants me to get rid of Garrett. That's not going to happen, Marcus said firmly. Garrett is a victim in this, same as us. He looked at her, his heart aching. They had come so far, endured so much, only to be trapped by the fine print in a dead woman's will. A desperate idea began to form in his mind. What if we go back to Texas? Elizabeth stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Go back? They'll arrest us on sight. Not if we go back with an army, Marcus said, the plan taking shape. Grimby's power in Clearwater Creek comes from money and fear. He bought the sheriff. He intimidated our neighbors. But people in Texas respect strength. They respect a fair fight. If we show up not as fugitives but as warriors, ready to make a stand, maybe they'll stand with us. An army? She asked, incredulous. What army? My men, he said. Tom Bradley, maybe others, and Garrett. His testimony is crucial. If he stands up in front of the whole town and tells them what Grimby did to him, what he forced him to do, that's more powerful than any ledger. We don't fight Grimby in a courtroom. We fight him in the court of public opinion, right in the middle of Clearwater Creek. It was a reckless, insane plan. A classic Western showdown against a man who held all the cards. But it felt better than waiting in a stuffy Charleston room for a lawyer to decide their fate. It was a Texan solution. They used the last of Maria's money to book passage on the fastest route back, a series of riverboats and stagecoaches that would be grueling and dangerous. They were racing against time, praying they could get back to the ranch before Grimby discovered their destination and laid a trap. The journey back was a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days, but with every mile they traveled west, a sense of purpose grew in them. They were no longer running, they were returning to make their stand. They arrived on the outskirts of Clearwater Creek, under the cover of a moonless night. Marcus left Elizabeth in a hidden ravine and crept toward his ranch. He found one of his lookouts, a young hand named Jake. The boy's eyes went wide with relief. Boss, you're alive! We thought they'd gotten you. What's the situation here, Jake? Marcus asked, his voice low. It's bad, Jake said. That gold rush story worked for a few days, but Grimby saw through it. He's furious. He's taken over the town. He's got his own men patrolling the streets. Sheriff Kane is his personal puppet. They've been to the ranch twice with a posse looking for you. Tom Bradley tried to stand up to them, and they beat him badly. He's laid up at his farm. And Garrett? What about Garrett Cobb? Jake's face darkened. Grimby found out he was here. He came with the sheriff and took him, said he was a material witness. They're holding him in a cell at the sheriff's office. Grimby's been visiting him. People hear screaming sometimes. Rage, pure and undiluted, surged through Marcus. Grimby was torturing him, trying to break him, to force him to change his story. And Maria? She's safe. She told them she's just a simple housekeeper, knows nothing. They believed her. She's been a rock, boss. Kept all the men's spirits up. Marcus made his decision. The time for hiding was over. He sent Jake with a message to his men, telling them to be ready. Then he went to Tom Bradley's farm. His friend was lying in bed, his face a mess of bruises, a defiant fire still burning in his eyes. Marcus, you crazy son of a bitch, you came back! Tom rasped. "I came back to finish this," Marcus said. He told Tom his plan, to confront Grimby in the open, to free Garrett and have him tell his story. "It's suicide," Tom said. "Grimby has 20 hired guns in town." "And I have a dozen loyal men," Marcus countered. "And I have the truth. Are you with me?" Tom struggled to sit up, wincing in pain. He grinned, a bloody, swollen mess. "When do we start?" The plan was set for high noon the next day. Marcus would ride into town alone, a direct challenge. His men, led by Tom Bradley, would position themselves on the rooftops, rifles ready. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble that could get them all killed. That night, Marcus and Elizabeth huddled together in the darkness, the eve of the battle. "I should be there with you," she said. "No," he said, holding her tight. "Your fight was getting us this far. This part is mine, but I need you to promise me something. If things go wrong tomorrow, you take the diary, you take the confession, and you ride. You ride back to Charleston. You show Pettigrew you're a fighter. You make him give you what's yours. You live. You promise me, Elizabeth." Tears streamed down her face, but she nodded. "I promise. But you have to promise me you'll come back." "I always come back for you," he whispered. The next day, the sun rose on a town holding its breath. Grimby's men were everywhere, their presence a suffocating blanket. At precisely noon, a lone rider appeared at the end of the main street. It was Marcus Thornfield, mounted on his black stallion, looking not like a fugitive, but like a lawman. He rode slowly, deliberately, down the center of the street, his eyes fixed on the sheriff's office. People peeked out of windows, from behind doors. Grimby's men, surprised by his audacity, moved to intercept him. From the hotel balcony, Walter Grimby appeared, a look of triumphant fury on his face. "Thornfield, you have the nerve to show your face here? You are under arrest for theft and harboring a fugitive." "I'm not here to surrender, Grimby." Marcus's voice boomed through the silent street. "I'm here for justice. I'm here for Garrett Cobb. Release him now." Grimby laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You are in no position to make demands. Seize him." His men drew their weapons, but before they could move, another voice rang out, "Not so fast." From the rooftops on both sides of the street, a dozen rifles appeared, all aimed at Grimby and his men. Tom Bradley, his face bruised but his hands steady, stood silhouetted against the sky. Marcus's ranch hands were with him. Grimby's men froze, their eyes darting nervously from the rider in the street to the rifles above. The odds had just changed. "This town doesn't belong to you, Grimby," Tom shouted. "Now, release the prisoner." Grimby's face was a mask of incandescent rage. He was trapped. He snarled at Sheriff Kane, who was cowering behind him. "Get him out here." Two of Grimby's men dragged Garrett from the jail cell. He was a horrifying sight, bruised and broken, barely able to stand. But when he saw Marcus in the street and the men on the roofs, a spark of life returned to his eyes. "Tell them, Garrett," Marcus yelled. "Tell them the truth. Tell them what this man did to you, to your wife." Garrett took a shuddering breath. He looked at the faces of the townspeople peering from the windows. He looked at Grimby, the architect of his ruin. And he began to speak. His voice was weak at first, but it grew stronger with every word, a torrent of truth that washed over the silent street. He told them everything. The faked death, the blackmail, Grimby's obsession with Elizabeth, the plan to steal her inheritance. Everything. As he spoke, the townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places, drawn by the raw power of his confession. They looked at the broken man in the street, then at the arrogant monster on the balcony, and they understood. They had been cowed by a bully, and they were ashamed. Sheriff Kane, seeing the tide turn, began to back away from Grimby, his face pale with sweat. He was a rat deserting a sinking ship. Grimby knew he had lost. The town, his hired guns, the law, It had all slipped through his fingers. His face twisted into a demonic snarl. He drew a pistol, not aiming for Marcus, but for the man who had defied him. For Garrett. "If I can't have her," he screamed, "no one will." But before he could fire, another shot rang out. Not from the rooftops, not from Marcus. It came from the alleyway beside the sheriff's office. Grimby staggered back, a look of utter shock on his face. A red stain bloomed on his white shirt. He looked down, then up, his eyes searching for his attacker. And from the shadows of the alley, Elizabeth stepped out. In her hand, she held a small smoking derringer. Her face was calm, her eyes as cold and hard as the Texas sky in winter. She had made a promise to Marcus that she would live. She had no intention of leaving his survival up to chance. Grimby collapsed onto the balcony, his reign of terror over. In the stunning silence that followed, Elizabeth walked into the middle of the street and stood beside Marcus. She looked at the townspeople, at Garrett, at the body of her tormentor. She had not been a victim. She had not been a prize. She had been the executioner. The war was over, and she had fired the last shot. The aftermath was swift. Grimby's hired guns, their paymaster dead, vanished like smoke in the wind. Sheriff Kane, in a desperate attempt to save himself, arrested his former employer's corpse and declared Marcus and Elizabeth heroes. The town of Clearwater Creek, ashamed of its cowardice, embraced them. Tom Bradley was a legend. Garrett Cobb, now truly free, was cared for by the town doctor. A few weeks later, Garrett stood on the porch of the Thornfield Ranch. He was healing, his body and his spirit slowly mending. He looked at Marcus and Elizabeth, who stood together, their hands intertwined. "I am still your husband, Elizabeth," he said, his voice heavy with sadness, not demand. "But I have no right to you. I will grant you a divorce. I will tell the courts I deserted you. It is the only honorable thing I have left to do." "Thank you, Garrett," she said softly. "What will you do now?" "Go west," he said with a wry smile. "California, maybe. Start over. Try to become a man you wouldn't be ashamed to have known." He left the next morning, and for the first time in 12 years, Elizabeth Hartwell was truly, completely free. With Grimby gone, Jonathan Pettigrew in Charleston was suddenly much more accommodating. The suitable character clause was conveniently reinterpreted. Elizabeth's inheritance, a fortune beyond her wildest dreams, was hers. But she didn't want it. Not for herself. She used a portion of it to buy Tom Bradley's ranch, a gift for his loyalty. She gave a substantial sum to Garrett to start his new life. The rest, she invested in Clearwater Creek, building a new school, a proper church, a library. She and Marcus established a fund to help women who, like her, had fallen through the cracks of a harsh world. They were married a month later, in the new church she had funded. The entire town came. Maria, her face beaming, stood as Elizabeth's matron of honor. Tom Bradley, healed and hale, was Marcus's best man. Their life together was not a quiet epilogue. It was a vibrant, ongoing story. They had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up with their father's strength and their mother's fire. The Thornfield Ranch became a beacon of prosperity and fairness in a changing West. Elizabeth never touched a gun again, but she never lost the iron resolve she had found in that alleyway. She became the matriarch of Clearwater Creek, a woman of grace, wisdom, and unshakable strength. Marcus, with her by his side, became more than just a rancher. He became a respected leader, a pillar of the community they had built together. Years later, an old Marcus and an old Elizabeth would sit on their porch, watching their grandchildren play on the lawn. They would look at the thriving town in the distance, at the vast, peaceful ranch, and they would remember the fire they had walked through to get there. Their love story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a war story. It had been forged in lies and loss, tempered by pursuit and terror, and finally won with a bullet fired from the hand of a woman who refused to be a victim. They had faced down the devil himself in the dust of a Texas street and had built their own heaven on the land he tried to turn into hell. Their life was a testament not just to love, but to survival. A testament to the idea that sometimes the only way to get your happy ending is to fight for it with everything you have. If you enjoyed this story of survival, justice, and redemption, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of history's forgotten battles, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Elizabeth's shoes? Until next time, stay safe and always be ready to fight for what's yours.